Assalamu alaikum. How are you today? I hope you're doing fine. The Caliphs. What is a Caliph? The Caliph is the most learned and the most pious Muslim person in the Muslim Ummah. And there is only one Caliph at a time. In the beginning, the Caliph was somebody who was elected by the other learned and most pious people. And the very first Caliph was a close companion of the Prophet, Abu Bakr, radiallahu anhu. And succeeding him was Umar, and then Uthman, and then Ali. And I would like to stop there because those four Caliphs were or are referred to as the rightly guided Caliphs because they did things properly and they were also Sahaba or people who lived around the Nabi at the time and learned from him. In fact, the fourth one that I mentioned, Ali, he was the nephew and the son in law of the Prophet. And the Caliphs that came after them, they started this whole um, inheritance of the Caliph's position, if I could put it that way. In other words, they passed on the position of Caliph to their son and so on until it was somehow wrested from the family and then it moved to another family. And that carried on for many, many centuries, so much so that it almost became the way that that particular institution worked, the institution of Caliph. But it never started like that and it was never intended to be that way. It was made that way very early on. Be that as it may, the position of Caliph is more of a spiritual than a leadership position. It was nice to know that there is a leader, and of course, the Caliph's name was mentioned in Jummah, and blessings was put on him. So everybody knew who the Caliph was, and it's nice to know that you have a Caliph. Of course, almost exactly 100 years ago, we're now in 2023, the Caliph sat in what's present day, was known as present day Turkey. And the Turks, or the Usmanians, or Ottomans as they were called, they sided with the Germans, or the Huns, in the First World War. And of course, they lost the First World War and they were almost invaded. And a general in the Turkish army, Mustafa Kemal, he came to the conclusion that the Ottomans were so easily beaten in the war because of the sedentary lifestyle that they were living under Islam, where the imams were all living in luxury, throwing parties and after parties for their friends and family. And they threw lavish parties, not the kind of parties that we know, of course. There wasn't music and dancing, but banquets, rather, and lavish banquets. And they would have gold plated lampshades in their houses, and they would have huge mansions. And people vied to get a position as an imam because it was a well paid job. And, people made donations, and the imam was the leader of the community in a particular section surrounding the masjid that he was imam of. And to cut a long story short, Kemal Ataturk put an end to all of this. In fact, he not only evicted the entire imamate, he evicted the Arabic language and the Arabic dress code. together with it. In fact, he sold all the paper that had any Arabic writing on it, government paper, to the point where he had to end up buying back some of the paper because he needed documents. I think it was sold to Poland at the time, and he had to buy it back. But that is how he reacted. And so that was the very last uh, Caliph, which was amongst the Uthmanians. And the Turks had the distinction of being the only non Arab people who had the Caliph amongst them. And they produced many Imams, and they sent highly learned scholars all over the world, and highly learned Imams as well, from Turkey, from Istanbul, and from Konya, which today is still one of the most religious cities in the whole of Turkey. I went to Turkey, and I specifically made a visit to Konya, and Jalaluddin Rumi is buried there. There's a huge mausoleum and a karamat where he's buried, a burial site, and you can go and visit his grave. And it's like you can do a tour, you can buy headphones, and then they explain to you what is happening and everything that's going on. There's a whole lot of other scholars of his buried with him and other people buried with him. It's a huge, quite a big mausoleum. And it was very full when we got there. And Konya is a very a religious city. And the saying is that people from other cities in Turkey don't like the people from Konya, although they're all Turks, because they say the citizens of Konya have this holier than thou attitude. But it's a beautiful city, and if you get a chance, you must go there because you will learn a lot from Turkey. And there you can clearly see the difference between the secular Turks and the religious Turks, clearly. And when the Caliphate was evicted from Turkey, that was the end of it. For the last 100 years, we haven't had a Caliph. The interesting thing is that we've lived okay for the last 100 years, we as Muslims all across the world, because, like I say, the Caliph was more of a spiritual leader, a figurehead, if you like. And throughout the centuries, even though there was a Caliph, uh, towns and cities of the Muslim world and areas under one person's control were ruled by a sultan or king. And the right hand man of the sultan was his vizier, who did everything, obviously on instruction from the sultan. But most of the time, the vizier was busy implementing general things that had already been prescribed by the sultan. And everything was, of course, according to Sharia. Now and then, the sultan would um, uh, shy away slightly from Sharia. And there were cases where the sultans went completely against Sharia. And there was even a case, I mean, Imam Shafi was locked up because he refused to condone the actions of the sultan in his area at the time. And they locked him up because they considered him to be anti government. But he was a highly learned man, and he was just applying his Islamic knowledge, and he couldn't agree with what they were doing. And he languished in jail. They chucked him in jail and they left him there. So the Khalif is more of a spiritual leadership. And the leadership is more related to your locality. If you look at Brunei, for example, Brunei Darussalam as it's called, that's a country that is called a sultanate because they have a sultan and they have Islamic law and they are a Muslim country. But they don't have a Caliph because the Caliph is the leader of the entire Muslim world, not just one area. They don't have a vizier, but they have a kind of a government like everybody else has. They've got a parliament. Um, but there is no Caliph. But yet, everybody all over the world functions perfectly well without a Caliph, without a single leader leading the entire Ummah. And I'm sure with all the meddling of the Western world in the Muslim world, they will make sure that there is no Caliph because the Muslim world is divided into countries. And Muslims are being controlled like that. But yet, people on the ground are still carrying on with their life in the Islamic way. The Imams are still Imams, there's still learning going on. Everything in Islam is still taking place. There are still scholars, there are still people going overseas, there are still people traveling, there are still ustads, maulanas, there are still qaris, there are still hifz students, the ones who memorize the Quran. These things are all still happening. And Al Azhar University, as a university institute and one of the oldest, if not, well, the university in Fez is the oldest, but it's not functioning. Whereas Al Azhar is the oldest functioning Islamic university that still exists. And people tend to look to them for fatwas and issues that are of a controversial nature. So, as Muslims, we have been doing quite well without a Khalif. So well, in fact, that I don't think people are even considering the necessity of having a Khalif. It's just that there always was one single leader for one single Ummah. And so that notion is still there. That is the way things were. That is something that the Prophet did. So we should do it, although we don't have it. But who knows? Allahu Alam. Assalamu alaikum.